All right, hey folks, we're going to do a little video interview, I guess, today. This is a new thing we're trying. I am joined by Austin Spreadbury, who is Director of something in product management at Metaswitch. Do you want to do a quick introduction?
Yes, I'm Austin Spreadbury. I am Director of Product Management at Metaswitch for a number of things, including, for the purposes of this conversation, Call Guardian Authentication Hub, our robocall suppression and stir shaken product.
Yeah, we've obviously been talking a lot about stir shaken recently. So yeah, Austin and I had some email back and forth, and I figured it would be good to have the chat live, and we can record and publish this. The other thing, those of you who may not know, is that Austin and I first met, I was looking this up, 19 and a half years ago. Does that make you feel old? Because Austin was my very first boss at Metaswitch. So the 21-year-old me rolling out of college showed up for work on my first day, and you were the friendly face I met.
Oh, well, I'm glad I was friendly, and I'd like to claim at least some credit to your rise to world domination since then.
Yes, you can claim a lot of credit whether you want to or not. I don't know, but yeah, I certainly learned a lot from you. So it was a good few years at the beginning there. All right, so stir shaken. Let's start general, and then we can maybe move more specific. It's an industry-wide problem with robocalls and caller ID authentication. It's a complicated thing to implement stir shaken across the industry. What's your sense of how we're doing as an industry in terms of rolling this out, or figuring out even a plan to roll it out?
Well, I think it's very much depends on which segment of the industry you're looking at. The larger carriers have been well involved in this for a long time, and of course the FCC has told them, come on, you need to get on and do it. So they are doing so. It was widely predicted that the FCC would give an extension to the smaller carriers, though I don't think we realized it was going to be 2 years when we first saw the Trace Act come out a year or so ago. And so that means that lots of smaller ones have taken advantage of not doing anything right now because, well, they've always got something else to do first, and going out and making money is probably top of that list. So it's a mixed picture. The big carriers are doing it, the smaller ones are biding their time. Now, the reason the FCC cited for going for the delay was to do with availability of products and cost, and I don't actually think those have turned out to be true. There's plenty of stuff around, but I think there are technical issues. So even if you just consider something as basic as the fact that by putting the identity header in, you're suddenly making your SIPIN byte several hundred bytes bigger, you suddenly run into all kinds of problems with going over size limits. And in fact, I saw something coming out from one of the carriers, I think it was last week, to some of their interop partners among our customers saying, yes, so we're going to be starting to send you this extra stuff in what we do. You might have all kinds of problems with your IP networking. The SIP stacks will cope with it, but it's things like the switches and so forth in your network that might suddenly start fragmenting your packets and stuff like that. So I think probably giving a little while to sort all those things out before everybody has to do it is probably no bad thing.
The other problem with that, of course, is that I know that some of the intermediate carriers are currently not enabling the transfer of identity headers unless you explicitly ask for it, because they're assuming that it's going to break something, which makes it even harder to know if things are working and to roll out your implementation. Cool. So we've got this extension to the deadline for small carriers, which is a good thing, probably, to help us kind of figure this all out. Although, yeah, I do think there are good reasons to implement stir shaken, even if you don't have to, even if you don't have a mandate.
I'd agree with that. Yeah.
But the extension comes with a caveat. There's a requirement. So yeah, the FCC has said that you need to do something called robocall mitigation to qualify for the extension. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is?
Yes. Okay. So the intention is, if you're not going to do stir shaken on all of your network, and you're going to have some traffic that's going to leave your network that can't be signed because it's TDM, or isn't signed because, although it's SIP, you're not doing stir shaken, you need to take other means to prevent the origination of unlawful robocalls on your network. And that needs to consist of robust practices and processes that you actually follow, that you can reasonably be you can reasonably expect to result in the reduction or elimination of such things. And you have to file details of what you're doing with the FCC, and they have the right to come along and look at it and say, well, actually, okay, so yes, you're doing ABC, but that's not enough, and they can impose stronger requirements on you to do more than you're doing. So, and it's a serious thing, because if you're not compliant and you're not on the register as being compliant, then downstream carriers are obliged to block your traffic. So it's a really big stick the FCC is wielding here in exchange for letting you off do stir shaking.
Yeah, it might almost be easier just to do stir shaking, but
yeah.
So yeah, so I think this is interesting, and this is particularly why we wanted to talk, because I wrote an article a couple of weeks ago saying, basically, as I look at this, and as I look at a typical small rural ILEC that has, mostly residential lines, maybe some businesses, that you could make a case that, robocalls aren't going to originate from the network, basically because you know your customer. You know who your customer is. They have an assigned phone number which they can't change, and generally speaking, there are some reasonable limits on how many simultaneous calls they make. You wrote to me and said, actually, I think it's more complicated than that. So do you want to share why you think that might not be enough for this kind of carrier?
Yes. Okay. So I'll caveat this by saying two things. First of all, I am not a lawyer. And the second is that the FCC will be the arbiter of this. So I guess we'll see. My thinking on this is that you can't guarantee that doing what you've just described is going to be enough, or maybe it's not the most cost-effective way of doing it. The FCC has been very clear. They want to be non-prescriptive on this. They want to allow each carrier to work out how best to do this for themselves.
Which is both very generous of them and also really unhelpful.
Oh, yeah. The only thing they've said is that it's got to be reasonably, it's going to be detailed practices. I'm quoting actually from the report and order at the moment, detailed practices that can reasonably be expected to significantly reduce the origination of illegal robocalls, and that you're actually following them. I think Brian Ford of the NTCA said something like, you can't just write this, put it in a drawer and then forget about it. You've got to follow it and show that you're following it. And also they resisted explicit suggestions by people who contributed while they were drafting the report and order. They resisted mandating doing things like requiring analytics, despite the fact that lots in the industry push for that for obvious reasons. So you are, as you said, left in this somewhat unhelpful position. The other thing you can look to is that the Wireline Competition Bureau put out a document very late in December 2020, when probably everybody was still recovering from eating too much turkey over Christmas or whatever, a best practice thing which sets out what they would reasonably think you could do. Now, of course, best practice isn't mandated. It's not even as strong as a safe harbor, and we know that the FCC has put out various safe harbors to say, if you do precisely this thing, then that means you will be okay. But you can look at what they said as being similar to that. And what they said was that they suggested that having the ability to analyze high volume traffic to identify and monitor patterns consistent with robocalls. Now, of course, you don't have to do that, but that's best practice. And if you can point to doing something that has been identified by the FCC as best practice, then that's very likely to mean that they'll regard what you're doing as compliant. And so the question you have to ask yourself is, if that's what you're aiming for, how best can you do that? Now, it may well be the case that for a smaller carrier, there's so little traffic and so much control over what your customers can do, that you can use tools you already have to do these things.
You could imagine some kind of analysis of billing records, maybe after the fact, or maybe even just some kind of monitoring of trunk usage or something could arguably qualify along those lines, for example.
Yes, yeah, that's precisely the sort of thing that you could do. So you have to ask yourself, okay, does that work for me? Can I reasonably see that would be good enough? And then, do I have the staff who are able to do that? I mean, it basically comes down to a classic build versus buy. type decision. You could make the config changes that you suggested in your blog entry. You can lock down the PBXs so that they're ANI-screened and can't use somebody else, can't use a phone number that you didn't issue. You can look at logs and CDRs, as you said, and that would maybe enable you to identify these suspicious patterns. But there's also things like there's a list of numbers that are unallocated that somebody might be using, and you might not have the complete list of unallocated numbers, or you might not know all of the IRS's do not originate numbers that often get used for scam calls. So you could equip yourself with all that information, or you could contract with somebody whose job it is to do that. And so it is, as I said, a build versus buy thing. Do you have to work it out for yourself, or can you go to somebody else who does this kind of thing as their main business?
As I was looking at it originally, I think if it was the case that you could set up your system in such a way to be confident that nothing was going to happen without requiring significant monthly maintenance, then I was thinking maybe that's a way forward here without needing to buy extra software. But as soon as, like you said, as soon as you have to be doing some manual work to be analyzing stuff on a regular basis, then suddenly the cost benefit analysis of buying some software versus having somebody spend 10 hours a month, or I don't know how much time doing this work, becomes very different.
Yeah.
So you are the product manager for Call Guardian Authentication Hub, which I'm guessing is just such a tool as might be helpful in this particular circumstance. What kind of thing could CGAH do to easily spot these kind of robocall patterns or whatever?
Okay, so I mean, currently it's geared up to do two things. One is the stir shaken piece, and the other is what you would think about as traditional robocall blocking on the inbound side. And we have the bottom tier of the available function there, UCB, for blocking all of the calls that the FCC says that you can block without further reference to your subscribers. So we are, as of second quarter this year, we're going to be bundling with that the ability to do analysis of your outbound calls, basically calls that you're sending off net into the PSTN. You can send to CGAH and it will run exactly the same analysis on that as it does on the incoming ones. It won't attempt to block them, but the point of the FCC mandate is not to block this traffic, it's to give you the information about what's going on so that you can tackle it at source and go to your customers and enforce contractual terms and what have you to get them to cease and desist from doing the bad stuff. But you configure your network elements so that the outbound traffic gets looked at as well, so that you can then take advantage of the sorts of reporting that's available on the inbound side, on the outbound side as well. So you can see suspicious changes in the composition. Suddenly you get a load of calls that are being flagged as being reputation -3, which is bad, whereas normally you see mostly +2 or +3 or whatever it is, or even just a spike in traffic, and then the ability to drill down into that. And we're bundling this function as part of the UCB package. So if you buy UCB for inbound call blocking, you will get outbound analytics as part of that package with no additional subscription.
Okay, you said something interesting there, which I hadn't thought about. It sounds like the expectation is not necessarily that CGAH would automatically block these calls, but rather it would alert you and you would then have an opportunity to kind of manually figure out the situation. You think that's the common usage rather than auto blocking?
From what I can see from other products that are also out there, so I think I saw a webinar by Transnexus in early January, and I'm pretty sure they're adopting the same approach. And I think Ribbon said the same thing. It does make sense. I think you want to be able to deal with your customers and get them to do the right thing rather than just block the traffic.
Okay, so I guess I'm looking at this and thinking, if you're getting Call Guardian Authentication Hub into your network, then how would a ILEC or a service provider in general decide whether it makes sense for them to just do this robocall mitigation piece, or if you've got it in the network, why not do the whole stir shaken thing and not apply for the extension? How would they come to that decision?
Well, at the technical level, all of the necessary pieces are there, and it's just a matter of hooking the right bits up. So for doing the robocall mitigation, you would effectively hook it up to your CFS before it's just about to send the traffic off net. For stir shaken, you hook it up to your perimeter at the point where it's sending traffic off or getting it back in. So it's pretty much of a muchness. It's different bits of configuration, but there are standard knobs published to do it, and PS available if needed. I think it probably comes down to what we were saying earlier. The interop issues that are likely to be faced could well be something that make you think, maybe I'll hold off for a little bit rather than do it straight away. If you can do it straight away, then great, because that means that you don't need to worry about all of the slightly more complicated requirements that the FCC has put out there to do with an extension, because you're not taking one.
Yep. If you have, as many service providers do, a hybrid VoIP and TDM network, so you know, very commonly you might have SIP trunks that you use for long distance traffic, but you are using TDM trunks for traffic to your local tandem, for example. If you were to implement stir shaken on the SIP trunks, are you still required to do robocall mitigation because you have TDM trunks in your network? I should know the answer to this. I genuinely don't know, so apologies for putting you on the spot.
Well, so this is where we go back to my very first caveat that I am not a lawyer, but my reading is that the requirements for robocall mitigation program, as per the report and order, is for those carriers who are taking advantage of an extension. So if you are not taking advantage of an extension, then that suggests that you don't need to do it. But I would want to get advice from a regulatory expert before making a definitive statement there.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's a good warning to finish on. Yeah, I've talked to a bunch of people on this, and I am assured that pretty much every carrier out there has a regulatory consultant that they regularly work with. I am not one. I have no desire to be in that business. Filing FCC paperwork does not sound fun to me. So you should definitely talk about this with the experts. Our conversation is much more from a technical point of view, because that's something that we can wrestle with as to the best approach. So. Just to wrap things up, as things stand right now, the FCC have kind of announced their plan for what they're going to do, but they haven't yet told you how to actually file information, you know, about your robocall mitigation strategies or anything like that. I think maybe in March sometime they've said that they're going to be doing that. Do you know the timeline on that?
Yes, March is the thing I have in my head as well. I believe that they're going to put out a public notice. I think not before the end of March, I think was the phrase, which will then set out the details of when this portal is going to be put in place that you have to use to do your filings, and all the information about that. And the date for when that will be available, I think, is around the middle of the year, June or thereabouts. But I don't think I know any more than that. I mean, maybe we should review the situation once that public notice has finally appeared in a couple of months' time.
I'm certainly looking at this and hoping that the FCC give us some more clarity when they make that announcement, because right now we've got a general idea of where they're going, but things are still a little bit fuzzy, and that's causing everybody some consternation. So,
yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Austin. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. I know it's been a long day in the UK, and you're at the end of your day while I'm just starting mine. But it's been a pleasure to catch up with you, and thank you for doing this interview.
Oh, well, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been fun.